I step into the reception hall I designed, and I know it's wrong before I can name it, the chandelier scattering light across glass and linen, while the flowers sit exactly where I told them to sit, the room breathing like a living thing poised to begin. I walk toward the family table, my shoes clicking through the quiet between music checks, and I count the chairs one by one without meaning to. One for my mother, one for my father, one for my sister, and a careful, polished space where a fourth should be. The clipboard rests against my ribs, steady as a shield, and yet my fingers won't stop pressing the edge. My mother turns with a practiced smile, as if we are neighbors at a charity luncheon. My sister lifts the lace from her shoulder and doesn't look at the table at all. I hold my breath just long enough to catch the moment the truth settles. 3 chairs, not 4. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever walked into a room you built and found there wasn't a place for you. I grew up outside Columbus, the kind of neighborhood with mailbox clusters and trimmed hedges where Saturdays meant errands and Sundays meant church, where being polite came before being loud and doing the right thing weighed more than saying it. My parents taught steady virtues: show up on time, write thank you notes, help before you're asked. I believed them and built a life that ran on those quiet rules, saving tip money in high school and learning to stitch hems on dresses because I hated wasting a good line. Brooke was sunshine in a different way, brighter, quicker to be noticed. The one who could laugh in a room and make people lean closer, and somehow that glow took root in our house, grew into a kind of weather system we learned to move around. When she wanted writing lessons, the barn found a spot. When I needed a laptop for college, I found a payment plan and practiced grace at the counter. It wasn't dramatic, just constant, like a faucet you learn to ignore until a quieter house makes you hear the drip. By the time I was 26, Lane & Company was a real business with a rented desk and a battered van that smelled like eucalyptus and ribbon dye, and I lived in a walk-up in Brooklyn where winter crept under the windows and spring made everything bloom overnight. My work took me everywhere: historic barns and hotel rooftops, ballrooms with carpets that swallowed sound, while my parents' world stayed country club, crisp white tablecloth dinners, golf tournaments with photos lined up on the mantel, a December gala that required a different dress code for the raffle volunteers. The contrast wasn't a fight, just a distance. When I called home with good news, the conversation was short. When Brooke posted a photo from Aspen, my mother forwarded it to relatives with 3 exclamation points and a heart. I told myself families have languages you don't always speak fluently, and I kept learning the words I knew: contracts, timelines, vendor trust. The first crack felt small, like a thread you notice on a sweater, and tuck back in harmless. At Thanksgiving last year, my mother lifted her glass and called Brooke the heart of this family, a phrase that landed soft and then sat heavy. When Uncle Stan asked what I'd been working on, my mother answered for me: "Harper is busy, always busy," and shifted the table to a new topic. After dinner, Brooke handed me a stack of glossy magazines marked with sticky notes, inspiration for the wedding she'd asked me to plan, and I said yes, because that is what I do. I make sure the day goes right. In the months after I walked venues with a measuring tape in my bag, sketched seating maps on napkins, and leaned on partners who've never once left me standing at a loading dock alone. The invoices went where they were supposed to go, and when a deposit lagged, I covered a gap, because a promise is a promise, and because the florist's son had a school trip that month. I don't dramatize work. You do it or you don't, and people know the difference, but the week of the wedding put a new kind of pressure on the day. The rehearsal ran late and turned bright with laughter for everyone but me. And I took a walk through the ballroom when the lights were half down to feel the space breathe, mapping where the big notes would land: the toast, the dance, the first slice of cake. That's when I heard my mother's voice from the next room, the tone she uses with committees and caterers, decisive and smooth, asking the staff to set 3 family chairs at the front. I stood there with my pen still in my hand and watched the place settings in my mind shift. It should have felt like a misunderstanding waiting to be fixed. It didn't. On the morning of the wedding, I tied a ribbon around the last bouquet and told myself the day belongs to the couple, to their grandparents, to the teenager in the 3rd row, who will remember the lights forever. I checked timing with the quartet, confirmed the kitchen schedule with the chef, and laid out place cards where people expect to find themselves names curling like small blessings under crystal. When I came back from the loading dock, the family table sat waiting as if someone had taken a ruler to it, everything centered. 3 chairs, the exact symmetry of a triangle, a missing fourth like a design choice. My mother lifted her chin the way she does when she's sure she's right. My sister adjusted her veil. I looked at the spaces I had made and felt something in me go very still. I approach the table and ask about the missing chair, and the answer is simple enough to pass for logistics. You don't need one. The sentence doesn't sting so much as confirm a pattern, and standing there, I notice the polished silver fork, catching light the smooth napkin fold, the empty gap that means more than anyone will say out loud. I don't argue. I don't plead. I have learned what work demands and what dignity costs, and both require a steady hand. I step away, and the room keeps glittering as if it has decided to do so without me. At a small table near the service door, I open my laptop and line up the tabs I already know by heart, the contracts, the dates, the warnings sent with patient language, the balances that have lingered too long. I am careful with other people's efforts. I am exact with promises. When the ballroom doors open and the music rises, I'm still in that quiet corner, reading the numbers that tell me where the day will bend if I let it. A server passes with champagne and doesn't pause, which is fine. I am not here to be seen. I close the screen with my thumb and look back across the room to the family table with its clean geometry. Somewhere behind the flowers and the gold-edged place cards, an answer has been waiting a long time, and it doesn't require a spotlight to be true. The service doors swung shut behind me, muffling the hum of the ballroom. But the image of that table stayed sharp in my mind, its symmetry broken by absence. I found a quiet corner near the storage alcove, opened my clipboard, and ran through checklists I didn't need to see. Every line was already memorized, but my hands shook enough to betray me. I steadied my breathing, tracing the ink across the pages until the numbers stopped blurring. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. A message from Sandra Kim the florist glowed on the screen. "We're only continuing because we trust you. Brooke hasn't paid us." My stomach tightened as I read it, the words echoing every unspoken bargain I'd made over the past months. Last week, when Brooke's card declined for the deposit, I had quietly moved $4,200 from my own account so her roses could be delivered on time. The mirror across the hall caught me as I stood. My navy dress, tailored and hand-sewn, fit, without a wrinkle hair pinned into a smooth chignon makeup neat enough to withstand the scrutiny of cameras. To anyone watching, I looked composed, professional, unbothered. Inside, the hollow stretched wider, fed by the empty chair and the quiet certainty that it had never been an accident. Guests moved past me, soft voices slipping behind programs, eyes glancing quickly before they shifted away. Compliments touched my shoulder in passing how beautiful everything was, how perfect the arrangements looked. I smiled and thanked them, my voice practiced to sound, even though each word scraped. Then a familiar voice broke through. "Harper, this is stunning." I turned to see Tessa Cole, an old friend from childhood, her expression warm and unguarded. Relief flickered through me as I smiled for real. "Just doing my job," I answered, but she tilted her head. "Your job? You mean you planned all of this?" I nodded and she blinked in surprise. "I thought you only helped with the dress." Her gaze shifted toward the family table before returning to me. "I'm surprised you're not sitting with them." The kindness in her tone cut deeper than if it had been blunt. I opened my mouth, but no words came, only the memory of the rehearsal dinner the night before. Elaine's arm had been wrapped tightly around Brooke as she introduced her to distant cousins, her voice bright with pride. "This is my precious daughter, the one who will inherit everything." When Uncle Stan had asked about me, she brushed the question aside. "Harper's busy with work. She's not really part of the celebrations." I had stood near the entryway nodding politely to people who barely remembered my name and swallowed the quiet sting. Now in the hallway, Tessa's question lingered, but I only said, "There was a mistake with the seating." It wasn't a lie, though. It wasn't the truth either. She touched my hand briefly before someone called her back to her table, leaving me with the echo of her surprise. Later, I settled into a small booth across from the venue at Cafe Roma. My laptop glowed in the dim light, the espresso cooling by my elbow as I clicked through folders I had organized for months. Statements opened one after another, the house in Columbus carrying not one but two mortgages, the credit card balances left to compound the overdue notices stacked like warnings ignored. Each line carried my mother's signature or Brooke's never mine. When I opened the trust account, my breath caught. The Grandmother Lane Educational Trust had once held over $240,000. Now barely $3,000 remained. Withdrawals marked educational expenses coincided neatly with Brooke's ski trips, her vacations by turquoise seas, her gallery announcements. The screen blurred until I pressed my palms flat on the table. My phone lit up again. Sandra's name flashed across the screen, her voice unsteady when I answered. "I hate to call, but the balance is still open. We need confirmation before 4. I promised to handle it, though another vibration broke across the line before I could finish. The caterer this time card declined payment needed. A third message arrived from the lighting technician questioning if the reception could even proceed without settlement. I leaned back, the weight of years pressing down. Memories surfaced uninvited the Christmas when Brooke unwrapped a show horse while I smiled over a sweater from the department store. The summer she flew through Europe while I worked double shifts at the diner. The week college acceptance letters arrived, her apartment secured before classes began, while I signed loan forms in my bedroom alone. "Responsible one," my father had said, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "You'll manage just fine." Those words had been meant as praise, but they carried an instruction, too, that I would survive without the safety she was granted freely. I closed my eyes, letting the pieces fall into place. Every gap I had filled for this wedding, every late-night correction, every dollar moved from my account to theirs. It had been invisible labor expected, but never acknowledged. And now even my place at the table was erased, deliberate and unspoken. The memories pressed harder. Just 3 days earlier, I had arrived early to organize seating cards. In the next room, I'd overheard my mother's clipped voice on the phone. 3 seats only. Harper doesn't count as family. She's just the help. I had frozen the stack of cards slipping slightly in my hand and kept working because that was what the day demanded. Now across the table in the cafe, I opened Brooke's Instagram post, her caption glowing bright on the screen. "So blessed to have the perfect family supporting my perfect day. Planned every detail myself. My handwriting showed clearly on the place cards in the photo. I stared until the words blurred, then pulled up the digital document I had drafted a week earlier. It was professional, precise, written in the same language I used for any client who failed to honor their contracts. My company logo sat at the top, the notice: clear services suspended for non-payment effective immediately. The cursor hovered over the send button, my hand steady now in a way it hadn't been all day. The echo of my mother's words filled the quiet. Just the help, just a shadow at the edge of their celebration. I pressed send, then forwarded the notice to every vendor still waiting for payment. As the copies left my inbox, something inside me shifted. The obligation that had wrapped tight around my chest loosened with every click. The silence afterward was not empty but clear, like stepping into open air after years in a dim room. Back across the street, the ballroom still glowed with crystal and music, unaware of what was unfolding behind the scenes. I closed my laptop, left a tip beside the empty espresso cup, and rose. The evening would not end the way Brooke imagined. The family table would remain 3 chairs, not 4, and for the first time, I wasn't going to cover the gap. I crossed the street, the hem of my dress brushing my ankles, and stepped back into the reception hall. Brooke spotted me instantly, her veil catching the light as she hurried across the room, panic sharp in her eyes. "Harper." "The bar closed and the hotel manager is asking for payment. Fix this." I met her gaze evenly. 7 days, I said. "I gave you 7 days to pay." The words surprised me with their steadiness. She blinked, uncomprehending, as the music faltered and staff began to move differently around us. The hum of celebration had shifted, small cracks spreading outward from a single point. I could feel the room changing even before the first glass was lifted from a table half filled. Something irreversible had started, and I wasn't stepping back to stop it. The music inside the ballroom faltered, the quartet lowering their bows mid-song as murmurs rippled through the tables. Waiters drifted toward the kitchen, champagne glasses half full in their hands. I stood near the center, my clipboard pressed lightly against my side, and watched the current of the evening shift. Brooke's voice cut across the noise, sharp and pleading, but I didn't move. For years I had filled the silence before anyone noticed. It covered every gap without hesitation. Tonight I stood still. Elaine's expression hardened as she moved through the crowd, her heels clicking across the marble floor. "This is absurd," she said, her tone bright enough for the nearest guests to hear. "You've always been background, Harper. Don't confuse yourself with family." The words landed with the calm precision of something rehearsed, meant to keep appearances neat. My hand tightened on the edge of the folder at my side, but I said nothing. Richard stepped forward, then his face pale under the lights. He lowered his voice, though not enough to keep others from hearing. "We can work this out. Let's talk privately." His hand hovered near my elbow but didn't touch. I met his eyes briefly, then glanced toward the 3 chairs at the family table. "The way you discussed removing my seat, was that private too?" The question settled between us, heavier than the silence that followed. I drew out the folder, sliding a set of papers onto the nearest table. "Here," I said, my voice steady. "Mortgage statements overdue, accounts the trust fund drained. Withdrawals signed by Brooke, authorized by Mother. The money meant for both daughters. Spent." Gasps spread in the crowd like a wind through tall grass. Mason, standing a few steps behind Brooke, froze with his hand still in his pocket. His gaze darted from her face to the papers, then back again. Brooke's shoulders sagged as if her dress weighed more than she could bear. "They told me you wouldn't care," she whispered, eyes glistening. "That you never expected anything from them." Her words wavered, thin and uncertain, stripped of the sharpness she had wielded for years. I looked at her, seeing not the bride, but the girl who once held a show horse's reins while I stacked diner shifts to cover textbooks. For a moment the image of that December afternoon returned, her laughter rising in the barn, while my hands smelled of grease and coffee. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispers growing bolder. One woman leaned toward her husband. "The sister planned everything and they didn't pay her." Another voice murmured, "Trust fund. That's supposed to be for both children." The words circled the room, picking up momentum until the hum of gossip became louder than the music had been. Camille Hart lifted her camera from across the dance floor. I caught the subtle nod she gave me before she began snapping photos. Her lens focused not on Brooke's gown or the cake, but on Richard's slumped shoulders, on Elaine's clenched jaw, on the cracks spreading through their carefully held image. The click of her shutter blended with the hushed voices, a rhythm marking the unraveling of a celebration. I signed the suspension confirmation with a slow, practiced hand, my name curling across the page. The weight of it settled into the room, undeniable. When I placed the pen down, I lifted my head. "Professionals get paid," I said, voice even. "You ignored every notice. I am enforcing the contract." My words carried just enough to reach the nearest tables, and I didn't need to raise them further. The silence that followed held its own force. Brooke's mascara streaked down her cheeks as she clutched at Mason's sleeve. "Please, just for today," she begged, her voice shaking. "Don't ruin this one day." Her plea brushed against something deep in me, the echo of shared blankets and whispered secrets before favoritism grew into a wall. But Elaine's sharp voice cut through. "She won't dare," my mother declared. "Harper knows her place. Always has." The phrase struck harder than Brooke's tears. A place. A shadow, just the help. Every version of those words over the years gathered together in that moment, layered one on top of the other. My hands no longer trembled. My shoulders lifted as I straightened to my full height. Grant Whitaker, the hotel manager, approached with contracts in hand. "Miss Lane," he said with professional calm, "we'll need your confirmation here." His deference was visible, his tie pulled neat, his attention turned solely toward me. Behind him, Elaine's protest grew louder, but the staff no longer looked her way. Chairs were offered to me, water set at my side, while her gestures went unnoticed. The balance had shifted. I felt it in the way the room angled toward me, in the way Mason stepped back slightly from Brooke, in the way Richard's hand fell helpless at his side. The celebration had cracked wide open, and all I had done was stop holding it together. I closed my folder, slid it beneath my arm, and turned toward the doorway. Each step echoed more than the last, the sound filling the space left by the quartet. Behind me, voices rose, confused, angry, pleading, but I didn't stop. When I reached the threshold, the sunlight poured through the glass, warm against my face. For the first time, the weight of obligation slipped clean from my shoulders. Still, the echo of their words followed me each step, reminding me what had been said in that hall. Just the help, not part of the family. A shadow. I walked into the light carrying those truths, but also something else, the quiet certainty that I had chosen differently this time. That night would not end with applause or toasts. It would end with consequences no one in that ballroom could deny. And as I stepped outside into the October air, I knew the unraveling had only just begun. The reception hall thinned like water draining from a basin. Guests carried their coats and gift bags against their chests, whispering as they moved past half-cleared tables. The 6-tier cake leaned at an awkward angle, its fondant roses untouched, while waitstaff stacked champagne flutes onto rolling carts. In the corner, Mason paced with his phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight and bewildered. My mother sat rigid at the family table, the 3 chairs still lined like a monument, her eyes fixed on nothing. I stayed near the service entrance, watching the spectacle fold in on itself, the very celebration I had built unraveling strand by strand. By evening, I was back in my apartment. The navy dress clung to me like a second skin as I slipped off my heels and set them on the rug. The quiet inside my small space struck sharp against the memory of the ballroom, but it carried its own kind of peace. My phone pulsed with missed calls. Elaine, Richard Brooke, even Mason. 19 notifications stacked across the screen in neat rows. I held the phone for a long moment, then pressed 3 deliberate taps to block each number. The silence that followed filled the room, steady and clean. In the refrigerator sat a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, a gift from a client months earlier. I eased out the cork, the pop echoing through the apartment like a punctuation mark. The bubbles fizzed in my glass light, catching their rise. I lifted it slightly toward the empty space. To professional integrity, I murmured. The words weren't rehearsed, but they felt necessary. My laptop glowed on the coffee table, a stack of invoices waiting on the screen. One by one, I called the vendors who had trusted me, Sandra at the flower shop, the bakery, that built the towering cake, the quartet who had played their instruments with care. I'll cover the balance, I told each of them. This isn't your fault. By the end of the calls, my credit card carried another $14,000 in charges, but their voices softened with relief. We always knew we could trust you, Harper, Sandra said, her tone thick with gratitude. That's why we kept going. I closed the laptop, a strange calm settling across me, despite the numbers staring back from my bank account. Emails arrived overnight, blunt and unyielding. Notices of default on the second mortgage updates from the Columbus Business Journal, headlines about lawsuits connected to my parents. One alert caught my attention. Brooke had changed her social media status to, "It's complicated." Hours later, another post appeared. Anyone need a slightly used wedding dress? DM for details. The words flickered across the screen, and I let them pass without response. The church secretary sent a note confirming Elaine's resignation from the parish board. My father's email arrived, next subject line marked urgent. I didn't open it. I simply deleted it, the keystroke decisive in a way words had never been. I turned instead to my phone's contacts. My parents' names had filled the emergency contact line for years, more out of habit than trust. I erased them, the box left blank for a moment, before I typed in Dr. Freeman's number. The substitution felt final, not in anger, but in clarity. Later that night, I scrolled through photos on my phone. Childhood birthdays, holiday gatherings, Brooke on horseback while I held a paper plate of cake. I hovered over the delete option, then paused. Instead, I created a new album and named it What I Overcame. Each image moved into the folder, not erased but reframed. I closed the phone and opened my journal. On a fresh page, I wrote one line. The empty chair wasn't a rejection, it was direction. I curled against the window seat, watching the city lights flicker against the October dark. Tomorrow would carry fallout anger threats, pleas, but tonight the knot in my chest had loosened. The apartment no longer felt small, only sufficient. For the first time, peace carried more weight than approval. 2 mornings later, the news broke. Lane family home enters foreclosure, the headline read. The words stretched bold across the screen of my tablet, the article detailing the collapse of the house that had once been a monument to perfection. I scrolled through the paragraphs without surprise, my coffee cooling untouched beside me. The emails kept coming. One from my mother's bridge partner, asking if the rumors were true. Another from LinkedIn, announcing Brooke was now seeking event coordination work. The irony sharpened when I remembered her speeches about my little business, the dismissal tucked behind each smile. Legal notices confirmed proceedings had begun on the trust. The account Brooke drained, the one meant for both of us, now under review. I set the device face down and rinsed my cup, the water rushing against porcelain. My hands stayed steady, the rhythm of movement unbroken. 3 weeks later, my mother appeared in the doorway of my office. Elaine Lane, once the face of country club fundraisers, now stood with gray threading her hair and a department store bag at her side. Her purse strap twisted beneath her fingers, knuckles pale. "We made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice stripped of command. "We need your help." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the weight of the invitation clear. A seat I offered freely, one I had been denied. "I needed your love my entire life," I said, my voice even. "You chose otherwise." Her lips parted, but before she could speak again, my phone lit with Brooke's name. I let it ring, the sound filling the pause between us. That evening, I listened to Brooke's message alone in my apartment. Her words cracked through the speaker. "The marriage is over. He left when he found out about the money. I didn't know how bad it was. Please call me back." Her voice trailed into static, the plea unfinished. Hours later, a formal letter arrived from my father. His neat handwriting carried across 3 pages of apology, folded carefully with requests for financial assistance at the end. The same pattern repeated again. My chest tightened with a quiet finality. I arranged to meet them at a coffee shop a few blocks away. Neutral ground, simple enough that nothing could be disguised by chandeliers or polished wood. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, the autumn light falling across the street outside. They entered together, shoulders stooped, voices hushed, but still a unit. Brooke trailed behind her engagement ring, gone her hand bare and restless. I didn't rise. I didn't reach out. I simply motioned toward the 3 chairs set evenly across from me. They sat slowly, each of them carrying the weight of choices that had led here. My mother's hands shook against her purse. Richard's eyes lowered to his cup. Brooke's gaze searching for something unspoken. The words they carried would matter less than the silence between them, but I listened. Elaine's admission fell first. "We always favored Brooke because she was easier to control." The sentence landed sharp like a truth long known, but never said aloud. Richard nodded, his voice low. "We took the path of least resistance." It was wrong. Brooke's words came last, fragile and unguarded. "They told me you owed us, that you were the less lovable child. I believed them." Their confessions filled the air, but clarity had already settled inside me. What I had heard at the wedding was enough. What they admitted now only confirmed it. Richard reached into his briefcase, sliding documents across the table. "We need help. The bank has given us 30 days to vacate. We thought perhaps your apartment?" I lifted my hand, stopping him mid-sentence. The silence stretched as they waited. "The debt between us isn't measured in dollars," I said, my voice steady. Confusion spread across their faces, disbelief following. I folded the papers and pushed them back across the table. "I wish you well, but we no longer have a relationship." Elaine's face crumpled, the composure gone. Richard sat still, his shoulders slumped. Brooke reached for my hand, her nails stripped bare skin around them, raw from worry. "Please, Harper." Her fingers hovered near mine, but I stepped back from the table. "The empty chair set me free," I said quietly. It showed me where I stood. I'm grateful for that clarity now. I gathered my bag and rose, the scrape of the chair marking the end. My steps carried me toward the door, the cool air beyond the glass waiting. Behind me their voices followed, calling breaking, but I didn't turn. Outside, the October light stretched across the pavement. I breathed deep, the crisp air filling my lungs, and felt the weight fall away. Some debts cannot be repaid. Some seats remain empty by choice. And for the first time in 33 years, I walked into the day fully free. I walked out of that coffee shop with the October air sharp against my cheeks, the sound of their voices calling after me fading into the background. For years, I had imagined conversations where they might finally see me, where the scales would balance. But when it came, there was nothing left to claim. The clarity that followed was not loud or triumphant, but quiet and certain. The door had closed behind me, and I didn't need to open it again. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into the work that had always carried me. Lane & Company kept moving autumn weddings in barns outside the city winter galas, with ice sculptures taller than I was, new clients who arrived because they had heard of the disaster in Columbus and wanted the woman who hadn't bent under pressure. I kept my head down, showed up early, stayed late, and made sure every promise I gave was honored to the letter. The phone still lit up with blocked numbers sometimes, but I never unblocked them. On a cold December morning, Thomas Avery slid a folder across my desk. "Italy," he said, tapping the cover. "Marissa Lawson's team called. She wants you." Marissa Lawson was a name that needed no introduction. Her music played in every cafe. Her face filled billboards, and her engagement had been covered by every magazine. I opened the folder and scanned the details: a villa in Tuscany, 300 guests, and a 6-month timeline. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a grin tugging at his mouth. "You built your reputation here. This takes it global." I flew to Florence the following spring. The villa's terrace overlooked the Arno River sunlight spilling across stone walls that had stood for centuries. My assistant Jenna moved through the courtyard with a tablet in hand, coordinating the staff like she had been born for it. The string quartet tuned their instruments, the scent of roses rising from the courtyard below. I stood at the railing, the evening air warm against my skin, and let the moment settle. "Everything is on schedule," Jenna said, appearing at my elbow. Then her expression shifted slightly. "Your mother called again, 4th time this month." I nodded the answer already formed, same response as before. She gave a small nod, understanding, and walked off to meet the photography team. I stayed where I was, watching her confidence, the way she moved with certainty. Lane & Company had grown into something larger than me, but it carried my fingerprints in every detail. Later that evening, my laptop chimed with a reminder. I clicked the link, and Dr. Miriam Freeman's face appeared on the screen, her silver-framed glasses catching the last of the Italian light. "Magnificent view," she said, adjusting her papers. "How are you feeling today?" I angled the camera toward the terrace before answering. "I don't regret walking away, only that I waited so long." She studied me for a moment. "And the dreams?" I shook my head. "Not in months. They've been replaced with better images." We spoke for half an hour, her questions steady, my answers measured. When the call ended, I closed the laptop and looked again across the villa's courtyard, where staff moved like brushstrokes on a canvas. The sound of laughter drifted upward, not mine, but enough to remind me that life had shifted. When I returned to my rented apartment along the river, the walls held photographs of chosen family. A picture of Thomas and I clinking glasses at our company's 5th anniversary, a candid shot of Sandra arranging flowers during a hectic summer, a group photo from a Vermont retreat with my therapy circle. Each frame marked a moment I had built with people who saw me, who stayed, not because they had to, but because they chose to. My phone buzzed with a message from Robert, a close friend I had met through work years ago. "Dinner tomorrow," he wrote. "Bring Jenna." I smiled, typing a quick yes. These were the ties I carried forward, not the ones that dragged me down. News from Columbus filtered in occasionally through mutual contacts. My mother had taken a job at a department store perfume counter, her polished wardrobe replaced with a uniform. Brooke's divorce finalized quietly after Mason uncovered the full truth about the trust. She had moved into a studio apartment that looked remarkably like the one she once mocked me for renting during college. My parents occupied a modest 2-bedroom in a complex they once dismissed as beneath them. Life had a way of leveling itself. One afternoon, I interviewed a young woman named Jessica Winters for an assistant planner role. Her resume reminded me of my own beginnings. Long nights, unpaid internships, juggling school and work, to carve a space in an industry that rarely opened doors easily. She hesitated as we spoke. "My parents think this career is beneath me," she admitted softly. "They wanted a doctor or lawyer. I've tried to explain, but they don't see it." I leaned forward across the desk. "Family doesn't always see your worth," I told her. "That doesn't diminish it." Her eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the wall behind me. A single empty chair beneath a chandelier captured the night of the wedding. "What does that represent?" she asked. I followed her gaze. "It reminds me that sometimes not having a seat leads you to build your own table." Understanding flickered across her face, quiet but certain. She nodded, her posture shifting with new resolve. I smiled, knowing she had heard exactly what she needed. That evening I stood once more on the villa terrace glass raised to the stars as they pierced the Tuscan sky. The air was cool, the courtyard below alive with music. The past was still part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had chosen my place, and it was here, surrounded by people who recognized the work, the integrity, and the worth that had always been there. And as I lowered the glass, I knew the next chapter would not be about proving anything to those who had denied me, but about building something that could never be taken away. The Tuscan sun had barely lifted above the hills when I walked the villa's terrace again. The courtyard below was empty chairs stacked neatly, flowers still fresh from the night before. It had been one of the smoothest events we'd ever pulled off every detail in place. Yet as I leaned against the railing, I knew the real turning point wasn't the work. It was the decision to stop carrying the weight of a family that had never once carried me. Back in New York, the weeks unfolded with a rhythm that felt new. Lane and Combing expanded contracts lined up months in advance, and my small office buzzed with energy each morning. Jessica Winters, the young planner I'd hired, shadowed me closely, eager to learn. I watched her work with the same mix of nerves and determination I had once carried, and sometimes I caught her looking at me as though my steadiness could anchor her own. One Thursday afternoon, Thomas came into my office holding a folder thick with clippings. He set it on my desk. "You'll want to see this," he said. I opened it to find article after article, most from Ohio papers. My family's foreclosure had gone public, followed by lawsuits from creditors and even whispers of fraud tied to the misuse of the trust. Photographs of the once proud house now appeared in headlines with words like default and sale pending. Elaine's name surfaced again this time, attached to resignations and unpaid debts. Brooke's divorce was no longer speculation, but confirmed. I closed the folder, the edges pressing lightly against my fingertips, and pushed it back toward him. "File it," I said. My voice stayed steady, but Thomas studied me for a long moment before nodding. That weekend, Jessica asked if she could join me at a small conference for event professionals in Boston. I agreed, and as we rode the train north, she shared stories of the subtle dismissals she faced from her own parents. "They still call this a hobby," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "They think I'll give it up once I get tired of it." I turned my head to the window, the trees rushing past in a blur of green, and remembered my own father's words. "You'll manage just fine." Different tone, same dismissal. I looked back at Jessica and said quietly, "Sometimes the people closest to you are the last to see your worth." She nodded, her eyes glistening, and we rode in silence for a while. At the conference, we were invited to a networking dinner. As we entered the ballroom, I felt the familiar shift in attention, vendors and hoteliers turning their gazes toward me. It wasn't about me as a daughter or a sister anymore. It was about me as a professional. Jessica watched the exchange carefully, then whispered, "This is the kind of respect I want to earn." I touched her shoulder lightly. "And you will. Not by chasing it, but by standing in it when it comes." The next morning, I received an email flagged urgent. It was from a law firm in Columbus, notifying me that the trust fund matter had reached court. My portion, once siphoned away, would be returned. The irony was sharp. I didn't need it anymore. I sat with the email for a long moment, then forwarded it to Thomas with a short instruction: set up a scholarship account. By late spring, Lane & Company launched a foundation under our name. We called it the Empty Chair Fund, designed to support young planners like Jessica's students without family support. People told they didn't belong in the rooms they had built themselves. At the launch event, I stood before a group of donors and students, my navy dress echoing the one I had worn that night in Columbus. I spoke of integrity of building spaces where everyone had a place, and when I finished, the applause rose steady and warm. Afterward, Jessica approached with tears in her eyes. "You turned something that broke you into something that lifts others," she said. I didn't answer, only hugged her briefly before stepping aside to greet another guest, but her words stayed with me. One evening that summer, I sat in Dr. Freeman's office again, sunlight spilling through her blinds. "You've built something lasting," she said, tapping her pen against her notes. "But what about forgiveness?" I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head slowly. "Forgiveness isn't the point. Clarity is, and I have that now." She leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes clarity is the beginning of forgiveness." I didn't argue, though. The words still felt foreign in my mouth. What I knew was that the absence of bitterness had created a space for peace, and I wasn't ready to fill it with anything else. By autumn, the scholarship had already funded 3 students. Jessica oversaw their onboarding, excited, as if the opportunity were her own. Watching her, I felt a quiet pride. The cycle had shifted. What had once been taken from me had been given new shape, one that no one could erase. Still at night, the memory of that empty chair returned sometimes, not as pain, but as reminder. The turning point that had freed me from a lifetime of shadows. I no longer avoided it. Instead, I let it anchor me, a simple truth made visible in polished wood and folded linen. And though I never answered the calls that still slipped through from unfamiliar numbers, I knew they would keep coming. My parents brook. They had their own lessons to face. Mine had already been learned, and the path ahead was finally my own. What I didn't know was how close the past still lingered, waiting for another moment to knock against the life I had built. The night of the Foundation's first gala, I stood at the back of the ballroom for a moment before stepping onto the stage. The chandeliers glowed above me, their light washing across the tables where donors, vendors, and young planners sat side by side. The navy silk of my gown brushed the floor as I moved forward, each step measured, each breath deliberate. When I reached the podium, I paused, let the silence stretch, and then spoke. I told them about integrity, about honoring commitments, about how an empty chair had once shown me exactly where I stood. My words carried across the room, not loud but steady, and when I finished, the applause rose like a tide, unforced and full. As the evening unfolded, I saw faces. I trusted Sandra arranging flowers near the stage, Camille catching candid moments through her lens, Thomas standing at the edge of the room, his arms folded with quiet pride. Jessica hovered near the scholarship recipients, introducing them to guests with an ease she hadn't had when she first joined us. I watched her for a long moment, recognizing myself in her nervous excitement, and felt the faintest trace of peace settle deeper in my chest. By the time the final toast rang out, I had no doubt the night had shifted something permanent. The Foundation had not only launched, it had taken root. The very thing once used to diminish me had become a symbol of strength. And yet, as I left the ballroom, my phone vibrated with a message from a number I didn't recognize. The preview line read only, "It's urgent." I set it face down on the seat beside me in the car and let the city blur past the window. The next morning, Thomas walked into my office holding a thick envelope. "This came by courier," he said. Inside were copies of filings, foreclosure, finalized assets, seized lawsuits naming my parents by full title. Attached was a letter unsigned asking for mediation. The handwriting on the sticky note was Brooks. I sat still for a long time, the documents spread across my desk, their edges aligned like an indictment. That afternoon, Camille stopped by to drop off photographs from the gala. She glanced at the papers still on my desk, her expression tightening. "Are you going to respond?" she asked gently. I shook my head. Not directly. She set down the folder of prints and leaned against the doorway. Sometimes walking away is the only response that matters. Her voice carried no judgment, only recognition. Still, the silence after her words pressed heavy. That evening, I found myself pacing the apartment, the city's hum filtering in through the windows. For years I had wanted justice to mean acknowledgement, apology, restitution. But as I thought of Brooke's note, my parents' pleas, and the life I had built without them, I realized justice had already arrived. Not in the form of reconciliation, but in the shape of boundaries held firm. A week later, I attended a small industry dinner in Manhattan. Conversations circled around new venues, shifting trends, and difficult clients. At one point, a planner I barely knew leaned across the table and asked, "Weren't you the sister from that wedding in Ohio? The one that fell apart?" The table quieted briefly, waiting for my answer. I set down my glass and said evenly, "Yes, that was me." Then I turned the conversation toward the scholarship fund, the students already beginning their internships, the vendors who had rallied to support them. The moment passed, but I felt the shift again. The story no longer defined me as victim, but as architect of something larger. When I returned home, Jessica was waiting with updates on the first recipients. Her enthusiasm spilled out as she described their projects, their gratitude, their determination to succeed. "They look at you the way I used to," she said, her voice softening. "Like you're proof it's possible." I smiled, not with pride, but with recognition. Proof was all I had ever needed myself, and now it was being passed on. That night I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the lights blink across the skyline. My phone buzzed again with another unknown number. I silenced it without looking. My gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the wall, the empty chair beneath a chandelier, captured in a single moment that had changed everything. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a compass. I leaned back, letting the quiet settle. Justice wasn't a headline or a courtroom ruling. It was the ability to live free of their weight, to honor the people who had trusted me, to choose peace over permission. And as I closed my eyes, I knew the story wasn't finished. There was still one more chapter waiting, not about the past, but about the life ahead. The weeks after the gala settled into a rhythm I hadn't known before. Calm mornings work that filled me without draining me, evenings spent with people who chose me not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. The phone still buzzed now and then with numbers I didn't recognize, but I no longer felt the need to answer. The silence no longer pressed against me. It freed me. In late autumn, I returned to Italy for another event. The Villa Terrace was different this time, not with the chaos of preparation, but with the ease of watching something unfold smoothly. I stood at the railing as the quartet played Below the Roses, arriving in neat rows, the laughter of guests drifting upward. My assistant Jenna leaned against the doorframe, tablet in hand, smiling as she watched it all come together. "Everything's running perfectly," she said, then hesitated. "Your parents called the office again." I nodded, already knowing my answer. The same response as before. She slipped back inside, leaving me with the music, the light, and a sense of finality that no longer felt heavy. Back in New York, my office walls began to fill with photographs. Not of childhood birthdays or forced smiles, but of milestones I had built myself. A group picture of our growing team, a candid shot of Jessica presenting at her first conference, a black and white print of Sandra adjusting a bouquet at dawn. These were my family now, not tied by blood, but by trust. They had been there when the floor fell out from under me, and they had stayed to help me rebuild something stronger. The trust fund lawsuit concluded quietly that winter. My portion was restored, though I no longer needed it. Instead, I signed the papers that transferred it into the empty chair fund. The account grew quickly, and with it came new students, first-generation planners, young women who had been told they weren't enough, people who had been waiting for someone to hand them proof that they could belong. Watching them step forward gave me a kind of closure no courtroom could ever have given. On a gray January morning, Dr. Freeman leaned across her desk during one of our sessions. "Do you still think about the chair?" she asked. I smiled faintly. Every day, I admitted. "But it's different now. It doesn't hurt. It points me forward." She nodded, her expression warm. "Sometimes our hardest moments don't just close doors. They hand us the keys to another one." A year after Brooke's wedding, I stood on another terrace halfway across the world. The sky was streaked with stars, the air alive with music, and the glass in my hand caught the light as I lifted it quietly. Around me stood the people who had become my chosen family. Thomas with his steady presence, Jessica laughing with the new scholarship class, Camille capturing every detail without needing to be asked. I raised my glass higher, not toward the past, but toward the life that had unfolded since. I no longer needed a seat at their table. I had built my own, and at it sat people who valued integrity over appearances, loyalty over pretense, truth over image. The empty chair that once felt like rejection had become my greatest direction. It showed me exactly where I did not belong, and in doing so, gave me the freedom to create a place where I always would. So if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge or forcing people to admit their wrongs. Sometimes it's about choosing not to sit where you were never welcome and finding peace in building something better. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of your own journey, I'd love for you to share where you're listening from. And if you've ever had to build your own table, I hope you know you belong at it.